I den neste delen av konferansen skal vi se på hvordan vi overlever. Det må jo være verdt å høre på. For å skape store nok endringer, endringer som monner, så må vi jo tenke større enn enkeltprosjekter og enkeltsektorer. For å skape store nok endringer må vi se på systemene som omgir oss. Og i siste del av konferansen fokuserer vi på fremtiden. Tenker vi stort nok når vi leter etter fremtidens løsninger? Og hvis vi ikke klarer å tenke så stort at vi virkelig kan endre verden, så må vi i hvert fall være sikre på at det ikke er viktige ting vi mister av syne. Stay human. Hvordan fortsetter vi å være mennesker i en verden som er blitt så annerledes som vi vet at den må bli? Kanskje er det ikke så vanskelig som vi tror. Vi skal høre fra dagens siste 2 talere, og jeg går igjen over til engelsk. Is it possible to change our growth-based economic system? Could a society not based on economic growth be not only sustainable, but also give us a fundamentally better life? The Oslo Arkitekturtriennale 2019 is exploring new ways to shape society based on ideas and experiment centered around the concept of degrowth, eller på norsk Nedvekst. One of the people behind these explorations is Maria Smith. She is a London-based architect, director of transdisciplinary architecture and engineering practice in Interrobang, as well as the structural, civil and building services engineering practice Webb Yates Engineers. Maria is a member of the RIBA National Awards panel, a trustee of the Architecture Foundation, and one of the Mayor of London's design advocates, and of course co-chief curator of the Oslo Arkitekturtriennale 2019. Please welcome Maria Smith. Sorry.
Hello, humans. Yes, I got a laugh. It's a good start. Okay. So hi, I'm Maria. I'm an architect and engineer and I work in London. But today I'm wearing my Oslo Arkitekturtriennale Chief Curator hat. I wanted to show you all my logo and feedback, please, later. The graphic design nerds will recognize the Interrobang. But yes, today I'm here representing the Oslo Arkitekturtriennale, and as Ingerid introduced, our theme is degrowth. And I'm going to just give a very quick kind of introduction into that, and then some very early high-level ideas, a kind of taster as to some of the kind of investigations that we're undertaking in terms of architecture and degrowth, and what can we as architects do. So forgive me for all of the obvious things that I'm going to say that you all already know, but I think they bear repeating. And forgive me for my cheesy cartoons, but I do enjoy them. First cheesy cartoon. So it's commonly held that economic growth is required to alleviate poverty. However, it's also commonly held that industrial economic growth really harms the environment, and so we have to transition to this magical thing, green growth, which is normally shown in kind of very inspiring graphics such as this one, where we can achieve economic growth and all of the marvelous kind of benefits of that, but without somehow damaging the environment. Green growth was something that became kind of popular since the 2009 OECD report, and basically means fostering economic growth and developing, while at the same time ensuring that natural assets continue to provide the resources and environmental services on which our well-being relies. Unfortunately, the capitalist systems that incentivize and rely on economic growth are actually not really helping very much in terms of social justice, and actually exacerbating inequality. I'm sure you've all read Capital by Thomas Piketty, and just to say that sort of capitalism automatically generates arbitrary and unsustainable inequalities that radically undermine the meritocratic values on which democratic societies are based. Also, very sadly, green growth is impossible. It's a real shame, that. But It's a great idea, and it would have been a marvelous thing, and I think perhaps a little bit sort of a reaction post the kind of 2007-8 crisis, this idea that sort of green growth would be an opportunity, a kind of a market opportunity in order to create additional economic growth on the basis of environmental projects. However, many studies since then have revealed and shown us that the level of technological advance that would be required to achieve this decoupling of economic growth and environmental impacts is just so staggeringly improbable that really it's not a good bet. We really ought to be looking at alternatives. And there's all kinds of things we can talk about, Jevron's paradox and Brooks' law and so on, that show us that the more that we make these efficiency gains, the more that we improve things, the more that other forces around that still continue to increase demand. And overall, we're still, if we're pursuing economic growth, heading for environmental collapse, disaster, sixth extinctions, and so on. And really, we need to review the basis upon which we're sort of measuring progress. So inequality is increasing. Thomas Piketty says towards 19th century levels, which is just staggering. And we're breaching planetary limits and on course for runaway climate change. But we ignore it. We ignore it partly because it's all just so overwhelming. It's massively electorally unpopular. But we also ignore it because we still have this hope that technology is going to save us. This is a slide by Norman Foster of his vision of the future. But there's still this enormous idea, sort of very, very seductive idea that we will find these technological breakthroughs and it's just going to resolve all of these issues, and we really don't need to look head on. We also ignore it because government finances, the way that our governments working, have been developed on the basis of ongoing growth. And it's just such a horribly fiendish task to start to unpick this that we'd really rather not have to. And finally, we've been talking about this guy all day. Finally, we ignore it because the wealthy elites that have the power to affect change, or have more of the power to affect change, are incentivized to maintain the dysfunctional status quo. Those are all great reasons to ignore it. However, very fortunately, the game is actually up. Economic growth is slowing down anyway. We cannot keep it up as much as we would, or some people would perhaps like to. It's actually, the kind of economic growth levels that we've been seeing since the Second World War are really arguably an aberration, and we cannot continue to progress on this basis. And we're starting to see this now. And so I think that this is actually, although it's often presented as really bad news, this is a glimmer of hope in some ways that actually non-growth economic systems have to be developed and have to be allowed to thrive because the growth one's faltering anyway. Inequality is starting to get so bad that it's even hurting the rich. That's really bad, that's brilliant. The thing is, the poor make really poor customers. They're terrible customers. And there's lots of really interesting studies about how people don't become poor because they make bad decisions. People make bad decisions because they are poor. And any one of us, if we were in those sorts of situations, would make poor decisions. And there's just lots of fascinating studies and reasons that actually it's no good for anybody, including people that people make satirical balloons out of, for this kind of levels of inequality to exist. And obviously, as we've been hearing about in various ways all day, climate breakdown really is upon us. We cannot continue to ignore it. This is an image of Penhadro who sailed to the North Pole in a sailboat. That should not be possible. So, what can we do? Well, I think we should be looking at degrowth. I think we should be looking at really accepting fully the reality and scale and timescale of climate breakdown. I think I favour, as many do, sort of using words like climate breakdown rather than climate change, because change just doesn't really doesn't really cut it. We need to accept that pursuing green growth is a fool's errand leading us towards catastrophe. We need to accept that the cited social and humanitarian reasons that we're still pursuing economic growth for aren't working, and perhaps, arguably, even a cover to avoid the tremendous political upheaval that would be required to think otherwise. And we need to start unpicking our growth-oriented systems to allow emerging modes of living that aren't inherently damaging to thrive. So, yes, the Oslo Arkitekturtriennale 2019 will be challenging the supremacy of economic growth as the basis of contemporary societies and investigating the architecture of alternatives. Now, this is important. I'm an architect, and I don't believe that just because I'm an architect and I'm not in a position of kind of governmental power, I'm not an economist, I'm not necessarily somebody that would be considered to be involved in this kind of decision-making. But it's important that everybody is looking at what they can do and what their industry can do. So it's really brilliant that we're here amongst all of these designers and architects thinking about how we too get to have a say in these kinds of issues and are part of the solution, can be part of the solution if we bother. Now, while the idea of the architecture of degrowth is probably quite nascent, we are trying to find clear and, importantly, optimistic strategies that we can employ. And I'm going to start to give a really basic list of some of the things that we're looking at, and this is by no means exhaustive. I'm sure by September the 26th, when the Triennale opens, it will probably have radically changed. But just to give you a bit of an idea of the kind of thinking that we're trying to explore and promote. So we can support economic systems that are outside of the mainstream economy. We can support these systems that reduce reliance on growth for employment and living standards. So, for example, things like self-building, time banks, and this is a Walter Segal. It's like a really old project, but the idea that if people are building their own houses rather than going out and earning loads of money, trading stocks and bonds and doing horrible things for the environment so that they can pay for somebody else to do this, that already starts to help that kind of indirect effect that we have. We can support women. This is like, I should have put this on first, but yeah. We can support education of women and girls around the world. This supports family planning, helps to sort of mitigate unwanted overpopulation through this kind of connectivity, conviviality, and gender equality. And there's so many ways that we can do this. And this is an Orchid Studio project in Nairobi, which is about training women in construction and really just making a profound change to this community. We can address intergenerational wealth sharing projects. So reducing our reliance on economic growth to effectively reduce private debt. So things like mortgages, things like student loans and stuff, the fact that we rely on interest rates and economic growth and to effectively reduce the size of those debts is necessary. And one of the ways that we can help to alleviate this is by better sharing wealth across generations. And this is a project in the Netherlands where they have a co-located elderly care home with student halls. And basically, students live here for free in return for 30 hours a month just being a good neighbour. There are all sorts of projects like this. But one thing that we can do as architects is help to make evident the inequalities and the environmental devastation, the repercussions of economic growth that we're sort of relying on as a distraction from wealth distribution. This is amazing photographer Johnny Miller, who's been using drone photography to reveal the kind of inequality that we see across the world. We can be provocative and propositional. This is an incredible project where they worked out the business case for creating a housing project being completely funded by a McDonald's advert. I mean, this shouldn't be a thing that is incentivized by our economic system. That's madness. But if we can help to make evident the social and environmental nonsense that's associated with growth, then maybe we can also help to sort of cull it. We can help to protect virgin land. This is one of the proposals that we're looking at of the Triennale, which is talking about a grave area ratio or a grave belt, and a lot of the stuff that Rachel Armstrong was talking about this morning in terms of sort of better incorporating death in and sort of the end of the cycle and the full cycle into our thinking is really important. But there are some really interesting, innovative ways that we can think about protecting virgin land with our kind of current mindsets that could, again, be very provocative. And then something that architects are really good at, it's a David Kahn project, but creating infrastructure that sort of genuinely allows equitable, high-density living. And this is just a design problem. We're great at design problems. We can do this is fine. But it's just allowing those problems to kind of come off the paper and stop being just models and ideas and bringing them into reality. We can explore alternative systems of ownerships of buildings and land, such that these buildings and land aren't damaged by their exploitation as financial instruments. And this is a fascinating proposal, one of the Triennale contributors, looking at how if we dislocate land and buildings and think of them as separate and look at the way that land values change and the way that building values change, then the game really kind of gets messed with in a really delightful way. But it's a very architectural proposal, but it's something that could be quite economically powerful. And these kinds of ideas can also help enable sharing and democratic access over ownership. And this is a Danish housing collective and all of the people that live in this incredible project. And again, there are lots of examples, it's just a random one. But the stuff that we know more about, perhaps as architects, is recovering and reconditioning rather than demolition and new build. But we need to do this much more radically. And I could have done any sort of a number of fabulous projects, but this happens to be one of mine, so fine. Though I did find out today that the contractor's gone into administration, so great news. Again, we need to reduce extraction, and there's lots of ways that we were doing this, but we need to do this radically. Instead of being less bad, we need to be more good, right? And this is the Brighton Waste House, and it's made entirely from rubbish. It's just fabulous. And radically, reducing pollution, emissions, toxicity, and this is Herdal Eco-Village in Norway, which is just one of some examples of really radically changing the way communities are built. And energy consumption, we need to really, this is a key one in Jevons paradox, right? The cheaper and sort of more ethical energy feels, the more we use it. That's not helpful. And this is actually a place called Greenbacks in West Virginia, and it's a quiet zone, which is because of this massive satellite, nobody in the town is allowed, radios, mobile phones, anything like that. And they all live actually excellent lives without the need for all of these things that we've become so accustomed to. And it's just an interesting example that there are places that maybe for strange reasons, but are models of maybe how we should think about things a little bit differently from the status quo. Of course, we need to promote afforestation and carbon sequestering in timber. And this is something, again, that many people are doing. Just happens to be one of my projects, why not? And we need to support new motivations. And just because, money and power are attractive reasons for creating fabulous new buildings, just random acts of free will, just doing things for the sake of doing things, and rather than being manipulated all the time into thinking that everything I do in order to be meaningful must be reinvesting somehow in society and in the grand economic project. It's just a really flawed idea, and actually, the more you can just waste your time in some ways is the better. Think about it. So I think we need to clean up Architecture's Act. This is some architecture soap that one of the Triennale contributors came up with. But I think we need to really take a hard look at architecture. How is it currently supporting growth dependencies? What can we do differently to stop this collusion? What can we do to dismantle these damaging systems? And what can we do to support alternatives? And what will the potential futures that aren't reliant on growth look like? That's what we're hoping to find out. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That leaves, not unsurprisingly, a few questions. So you're not allowed to go just yet. Thank you for all those optimistic examples. I think it's great that we've gotten that far, that the problem is stated, and now we can finally look for some good solutions, as you say, to be more good rather than less bad, I think is essential. As an architect, my problem is the stuff that I do is really expensive. Architecture is a communal effort, and by that it is very much tied in with our present economic system. It takes, and it's almost impossible to dislodge from that. Care to comment? If I'm going to build anything bigger than a garden shed?
I mean, yeah, but also the fact that we are very much in some ways, we're in the property industry, we're working at the coalface of economic growth. That's also one of the reasons that we need to be involved in this conversation. If we're colluding and we're currently spending, millions of hours of architectural energy on this thing that is detrimental, then surely redirecting some of that has an enormous amount of potential for change. But critically, we need to understand, we need to arm ourselves with the kind of knowledge and understanding as to the real implications of what we're doing, and then we will, like half the problem's understanding that you've got a problem, right? And then we will just start to change. I think it already, like the people around me and ourselves that have been researching into this, we can't specify things in the way that we could casually specify things, and that's just a really small change. I think the more that we know that this is an issue and that we're colluding in something damaging, then it's all bubbling, it's going to happen.
And I think the other thing as well that is detrimental in the building industry is that it is already defined who is going to sit down at the table. When you start a building project, there will be this person, there's a client, there's the architect, there's the engineer, there's a quantity surveyor, there might be a banker or two. But also to invite and to extend that conversation is partly what is happening, for example, in lots of service design projects, as I understand them, which I think would be a tremendous place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you mentioned in your introduction to Arena earlier, we've been looking at how social communities can work together in order to affect change of their own built environment for so long. They've been really brilliant exemplar projects since the 70s, and yet we're still having this conversation, and it's still somehow radical, and that's ridiculous, and I completely agree with you. I think that probably this focus on growth above all else is a big reason for that, because the money is still talking the loudest. So I think, and I hope that as we start to unpick that I don't think there's going to be suddenly a wasteland and a dearth of ideas for processes and systems and things. I think that's all there. It's just waiting to be allowed to flourish.
And in more places. Thank you very much, Maria Smith.
Thank you.